I'm your host, G.I. Wingnut. Welcome back to my channel. In this episode, we are continuing with the book Atlantis and Lemuria by Rudolph Steiner, an acolyte of Helena Blavatsky. So, in this episode, we're doing Chapter 3. Let's get on into it. Go. Chapter 3, Transition of the Atlantean into the Aryan Root Race. The following communications refer to the transition of the fourth Atlantean root race into the fifth Aryan, to which belongs civilized mankind of the present day. Sounds logical or reasonable enough if you want to make excuses. He only will estimate them correctly who is able to grasp the idea of evolution in its fullest meaning. Everything that comes to the notice of man and his surroundings is in condition of development. Okay, that sentence I can agree with because things are always changing around us. Plants are always adapting, animals are always adapting. Heck, humans have the ability to adapt their environment. In fact, one of the things I learned in the military was adapt and overcome. It's part of physical therapy as well. Anyway, moving right along. And it must also be remembered that the peculiar characteristic of men of our fifth root race, consisting in the use of thought, has but just developed. Yeah, because that was a development out of the fourth root race. So because we remember they shared thoughts through images, not actually coherent the way humans think today. Like telepathic hieroglyphs, I'm guessing. Anyway, moving on. Indeed, it is this root race that slowly and gradually brings the power of thought to maturity. Oh, we're seeing a lot of that in the New Apostolic Reformation and modern technology. Moving on. The man of the present makes up his mind and carries out his decision on the strength of his own thought. Just by thought? No, it takes action. Moving on. With the Atlanteans, this capacity was only in preparation. Not their own thoughts, but those which flowed in upon them from beings of a higher kind, influenced their will, which was thus guided in a sense from without. Hey, wait a minute. A higher kind? Doesn't Kent Hovind talk about kinds of animals in the flood? That's one of those crazy things. But why don't they just say like a higher kind, a higher being? Gods, but they've been talking about ascended masters. Anyway, moving on. He who makes himself familiar with this conception of evolution in regard to man, and who learns to admit that he was, in prehistoric times, and as an inhabitant of the earth, of an altogether different constitution, will also be able to advance the conception of those wholly different beings to whom reference is made in these communications. Aliens? Greys? Reptilians? What are we talking about here? Moving on. The development which is under consideration occupied enormous periods of time. Details of this will be shown more circumstantially in the following communications. What has previously been said about the fourth root race, the Atlantean, refers to the great general mass of mankind, but the latter found themselves under leaders who towered high above them in ability. The wisdom possessed by these leaders and the powers of which they were masters could not be obtained through any earthly education, but were imparted to them by entities of a high rank and not pertaining directly to the earth. Oh, holy cow. Sid Roth, Angel visitations. Jesus playing saxophone at the foot of somebody's bed. Um, Cat Kerr going to heaven. Others always going to heaven. Um, the impartations of blessings and stuff from the New Apostolic Reformation, lifting up new apostles and prophets. I'm putting air quotes on that. I know you can't see it, but anyway, moving on. It was therefore quite natural that the great mass of mankind regarded these, their leaders, as beings of the higher kind, as messengers of the gods. For that which these leaders knew and were able to achieve could not have accomplished by means of human sense organs or human understanding. They were worshipped as, quote, divine masters, end quote, and their precepts, commands, and instructions were accepted. By such beings, mankind was instructed in sciences, arts, and the construction of tools. Holy shit, this sounds like the Anunnaki legends, Book of Enoch stuff. Oh boy. Um, as such, divine messengers. Oh, I'm sorry, divine messengers. Yeah, not masters. Which divine messengers? That would be angels, right? In a Christian context, sorta. Anyway, as such, divine masters either directed the communities themselves or instructed such men as were sufficiently developed in the arts of governing. These leaders were said, quote, to hold intercourse with gods, end quote, and to be initiated by these themselves in the laws according to which mankind was to develop. So in this particular context, I'm supposing that they mean intercourse with the gods as in talking with, communicating with the gods. All right, moving on. And this was in accordance with fact. Whose fact? Anyway, this initiation, this intercourse with the gods, occurred at places quite unknown to the populace. Quote, temples of mysteries, end quote, was the name given to these places of initiation, and it was from their midst that mankind was governed. Huh. I'm wondering if that makes any kind of reference to some of those quote unquote portals and stuff down there in Peru. Just asking questions out loud, alternate history stuff. Anyway, continuing. That which took place in the temples of mysteries was, accordingly, incomprehensible to the populace, and only very slightly did the latter understand the purposes of their great leaders. Huh. I've been hearing some folks talking about how Trump is some sort of great leader that we just can't understand uh, what his purposes are. I hear that from the Q people. Uh, I've heard that from a lot of those Trump falfits. Anyway, moving on. The people could, indeed, understand with their senses only what happened immediately on earth, not what was revealed from higher worlds. So it needs that intercessor to do the translating. Gotcha. Continuing. Consequently, the teachings of the leaders had also to be clad in a form which was unlike the form used in the communication of earthly matters. Oh, okay, kind of like, let's see, Timothy Dixon, Robin Bullock, um, what's his name? David Winch? Anyway, so many of those MAGA falfits. Moving on. The language used in the mysteries between the gods and their messengers was, indeed, no earthly tongue, nor were the forms assumed by the gods in their manifestations of an earthly kind. Uh, Angelic languages, speaking in tongues, evangelical stuff, New Apostolic Reformation, just wondering. Okay, continuing. Quote, and how men were to be guided, only a man can appear in human form. Entities whose faculties surpass the human level must manifest under forms which are not to be found among those of Earth. Oh, shape-shifting reptilians who can project new images into your head so you don't perceive them as the reptiles that they are, or any one of the other alien races. Interesting. Moving on. The fact that the messengers of the gods could receive the revelations was owing to their attainment of the highest degree of development among their human brothers. Okay. Um, Kurt von Daniget. Well, that was Chariots of the Gods, but moving on. They had already, in earlier stages of evolution, gone through what the majority of men have yet to experience. Only in a special way did they belong to this contemporaneous mankind. They could assume the human form, but their psychospiritual faculties were superhuman in character. They were, therefore, divine human double entities. Oh, wow. Moving on. Hence, they might also be described as higher spirits who had assumed human bodies in order to help mankind further along the earthly path. Thanos picking up new bodies, maybe? Scientology stuff. Moving on. Their true home is not on Earth. Oh, so they're extraterrestrials or are they interdimensional? I'm just asking questions from the point of view of a conspiracy theorist. Moving on. These entities guided man without being able to communicate to him the principles according to which they were leading him. For up to the fifth subrace of the Atlanteans, the original Semites, men had absolutely no capacity whatever wherewith to grasp these principles. So they were that primitive. Okay. It sounds like maybe there might be reference to the Pleiadians, the tall blonde-haired people that came to Earth allegedly to take on all the reptilians and save mankind. Yeah, that's part of the Ascended Masters lore. Moving on. Not until the power of thought began to develop in this subrace did such capacity exist. But this faculty developed slowly and gradually. Even the last subraces of the Atlanteans could yet, or as yet, let me try that again. They began by having a, okay, I got lost there. Even the last subraces of the Atlanteans could as yet understand very little of the principles of their divine leaders. Okay, I'm hearing that kind of thing today from cult leaders, specifically within the NAR. They continuing, they began by having a very vague presentiment, yes, presentiment of such principles. Consequently, their conceptions and also the laws mentioned in connection with their civic institutions were intuitive rather than definitely thought out. Now, it sounds like they might be making reference to something called natural law, which sounds a whole lot like God-given rights for humanity. Continuing, the chief leader of the fifth Atlantean subrace had for his object to bring it gradually to such a point that it could be, later on, and after the disappearance of the Atlantean mode of living, initiate a new one, such as would be completely regulated by the power of thought, which is supposed to come into full effect by the sixth subrace, or root race, from what I remember from previous studies that I've done on my own. Continuing, now we must realize that the end of the Atlantean era is characterized by these groups of human entities. There are, firstly, the so-called messengers of the gods, who were advanced far beyond the great mass of the people, teaching divine wisdom and performing divine deeds. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, faith healers, word of faith stuff. All right, moving on. Secondly, there was a great mass itself in which the power of thought was in a state of torpor, although it possessed other natural faculties which have since been lost. Thirdly, there was a smaller number of such as developed the thinking capacity. These, it is true, gradually lost the primeval faculties of the Atlanteans, but they developed instead the capacity to grasp in thought the principles of the messengers of the gods. So they became aware, they became alert, they became cognitive, sentient beings. Is that what they're getting to? So before that, they were just automatons, I guess. All right, moving on. The second group of human entities was destined to die out gradually. The third, however, admitted of such an education by the entities of the first group that it could be henceforward take its over its own guidance. And okay, so self-governance. They developed self-governance because they became sentient. Moving on. From the midst of this third group, selection was made by the aforesaid chief leader, who is known in theosophical literature by the name of Manu. Of these, most capable of forming the nucleus of a new mankind. Sounds a lot like eugenics to me. And Manu is, at least the Manu that I'm aware of, is a Polynesian reference. All right, moving on. These fittest people were to be found in the fifth subrace. Survival of the fittest, Darwinism. Okay, moving on. The thought power of the sixth and seventh subraces was in a certain way already on the downward path and no longer fit for further development. The best qualities of the best men were to be developed. Yes, definitely eugenics. This was achieved by the leader sequestering the elect in a particular spot on Earth in Central Asia and freeing them from every influence of those left behind or gone astray. Wow. Wow. Isolation, segregation, this is culty stuff. And for the purpose of selective breeding, sounds like Joy Division from the Third Reich. Because, the others are impure. Eugenics all the way. Moving on. The task undertaken by the leader was to conduct his disciples so far on that they could grasp in their own soul and their own thought the principles according to which they were previously directed and which they faintly understood. Men were now meant to understand the divine powers which they had formerly followed blindly. Okay. Continuing. So far, the gods had led men through their messengers, angels. Henceforth, men should know of these divine beings. They were to consider themselves as executive organs of divine providence. Interesting. So they were to consider themselves as executive or Kat Kerr, Robin Bullock, Greg Locke, the boys and girls over there at Bethel and Hillsong. Moving on. This isolated group of elite peoples had to face an important change. The divine leader was in their midst in human form. Like Sun Yin Moon. He claimed to be a god. In fact, that's the topic for another talk. There's so many divine leaders Anyway, Marshall Applewhite, David Koresh, Jim Jones, William Branham. Moving on. From such divine messengers, mankind had previously received directions or commands as to what was to be done or left undone. It had been taught in sciences which referred to what could be observed by the senses. Men suspected the fact of a divine government of the world. They felt as much in their own actions, but they had no clear knowledge of this fact. Oh man, I hear a lot of conspiracy theories about that happening these days. Here a while back, I had a conversation with somebody that thought that there was some sort of entity that was trying to kill the sun to kill us, either make it blow up or make it burn out. I'm not sure which. Spiritual warfare, prayer warriors, Michael Flynn stuff. Anyway, continuing, their leader now spoke to them quite differently. I don't like Elizabeth Clare Prophet with her rapid chatter. Moving on, he taught them that invisible powers governed what was visible before them, and that they themselves were servants of these invisible powers, that with their thoughts they had to execute the laws of these powers, and that the invisible spiritual element was the creator and preserver of the visible material world. Prayer warriors, Mike Flynn, the Moravians, holy mackerel. Moving on. Hitherto they had looked up to their visible messengers of the gods, to those superhuman initiates of whom he was talked to them, thus was himself one, and by whom they were directed as to do what to do or to avoid. That sounds like some Aleister Crowley nonsense to me. But, Rudolph Steiner was connected to Blavatsky, and Blavatsky and Crowley were contemporaries. Moving on. Now, however, they were found worthy of being instructed by the divine messenger of the gods. Powerful was the injunction impressed again and again on his followers. Quote, "Hitherto ye have seen those who were your leaders, but there are higher leaders whom ye see not, and ye are subject to these leaders. Fulfill the commands of the God whom ye see not, and obey him of whom ye can make to yourselves no image." End quote. Oh my goodness. Moving on. Thus sounded from the lips of the great leader the new and highest commandment, prescribing the worship of a God whom no image, visible to the senses, could resemble, of whom, therefore, none of the senses should be made, or none should be made. That sounds like the rules of Islam. Moving on. An echo of this great primary commandment of the fifth race is heard in the well-known phrase, quote, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likenesses of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." End quote. Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 and 4. Who remembers the golden Trump statue at CPAC? Moving on. Assisting the chief leader Manu, there were other messengers of the gods who excluded his designs with regard to particular branches of life, and helped in the development of the new race. For the object was to arrange the whole of life comfortably with the new conception of a divine government of the world. The thoughts of men were to be turned in every respect from the visible to the invisible. Reawaken America! Get all you prayer warriors out there. This is spiritual warfare, says them NAR wackadoodles. Moving on. Life is determined by natural forces. The course of this human life depends on day and night, winter and summer, sunshine and rain. How these momentous visible facts are connected with the invisible divine forces, and how man should act so as to live in accordance with these invisible powers. All this was shown to him. All knowledge and all work were to be pursued in this sense. Again, this is sounding an awful lot like the Book of Enoch. Continuing. In the course of the stars and in atmospheric conditions, man was to see the degrees of providence, the expression of divine wisdom. Astronomy and meteorology were taught in this sense, and man was to bring his work, his moral life, into harmony with the laws of the divine that were so rich in wisdom. Life was ordered according to the divine commandments, since in the course of the stars, in meteorological conditions, etc., divine thoughts were fathomed. Man was to bring his work into harmony with dispositions of the gods through sacrificial deeds. Man, I'll tell you what, those prayer warriors over there in the evangelical movement, man, they got this thing in spades for sure. Moving on. It was the intention of the Manu to direct everything in human life towards the higher worlds. The Book of You, the esoteric baptisms to gain ascension through the gates of heaven, to get through the different storehouses, to get to the throne room, which apparently Cat Kerr and a bunch of others have figured out the whole shortcut to the thing. To direct everything in human life towards the higher worlds. Yeah, Sid Roth got that one too, didn't he? Moving on. All human action, all arrangements were to bear a religious character. Oh. In this way, the Manu wished to lead the way to that which constitutes the special task of the fifth root race. This race was to learn to guide itself onward through its own thoughts. Such self-determination, however, can lead to salvation only when a man gives his own self also to the service of the higher powers. Man should make sure of his thinking capacity, but this power of thought should be uplifted by the mindfulness of the divine. I'm not sure what to make of that. Man should make sure to use his thinking capacity. That makes me think about some of the science chats I'm putting air quotes on science chats and psychology stuff, and again air quotes on psychology in this context. Of man only uses 10% of his brain to think. There's also a big chunk of the brain that's used for autonomic purposes, like, I don't know, feeling pain or keeping your heart beating. Moving on. Moving on. To grasp completely what happened at that time, it is also necessary to know that the development of the thinking capacity, beginning with the fifth subrace of the Atlanteans, brought about a still further consequence. In a certain direction, men acquired branches of knowledge and performed acts which were in no immediate connection with what the Manu had to consider as his proper task. People figured out how to work the magic. Okay, that is exactly why Aleister Crowley was focused on Enochian magic in the Solar Temple. Moving on. These acquirements and arts lacked, first of all, the religious character. They dawned on man at a time when his only thought was to exploit them for his own advantage, for his personal wants. To such acquirements belongs, for instance, that of fire in its application to human industry. At the beginning of the Atlantic era, men had no need of fire, as the vital force was still at his disposal. With this decrease of his ability to avail himself of this force, he was obliged to learn how to fashion his tools and implements from so-called lifeless things. Okay, so this sounds like Scientology talking about the degradation of man. Moving on. Here, the use of fire became most advantageous, and it was the same with regard to same regard to other natural forces. Man had also learned to make use of these forces without being conscious of their divine origin. This, indeed, was inevitable. Man was not to be forced to link these things. These assisted only his mentality with the divine order of things. This he was rather meant to do voluntarily in his thoughts. The intention of the Manu was, then, to evoke in men a spontaneous need to establish a connection between such things and the higher order of the world. Is that how we got physics and astrophysics and a lot of the conspiracy theories that are running around these days about you got to understand they've been lying to us. It's all been hidden. Oh, good grief. Moving on. Men could, as it were, choose whether they would exploit the acquired knowledge for purely personal benefit or use it in the religious service of a higher world. That definitely sounds like Scientology. Moving on. Just as man had previously been forced to consider himself as a part of the divine ruling of the world, from which there flowed on him, for instance, the mastery of the vital force without any need of mental effort. So now he could also make use of natural forces without giving thought to the divine, and develop psychic abilities. Moving on. Of those whom the Manu had gathered around himself, all were not ripe for the change. Indeed, very few of them were so, and only from those could the nucleus of the new race be actually formed by the Manu. It was, then, only with this small number that the Manu retired in order to further their development, while the rest became merged in the general mass of mankind. It was then from this small number of men, thus finally grouped around the Manu, that all true germs of progress in the fifth root race up to the present time were derived. Thus, however, it became plain that the whole development of this root race displays two characteristic features. One of these distinguishes those who were animated by higher ideals, and who consider themselves as the children of the divine universal power. The other appears in those who make everything subservient only to personal interests and selfish ends. This little band remained with the Manu until it had become strong enough to act in the new spirit, and until its members could be set forth to impart this new spirit to that portion of mankind which remained over from the preceding races. This new spirit naturally assumed a different character with various nations, according to the different phases of their development. The old surviving characteristics became mixed with the messengers of the Manu, brought into the various parts of the world, and in this way, manifold new cultures and civilizations arose. The fittest personalities of those surrounding the Manu were chosen to become initiated little by little into his divine wisdom so that they might become teachers to the rest. Thus, it was that along with the old messengers of the gods, there now arose a new kind of initiates. Okay. Going back to this new spirit thing. Makes me wonder about Robin Bullock stuff, and all that. Continuing. Thus, it was, hang on. Thus, it was that along with the old messengers of the gods, there now arose a new kind of initiates. These were they who developed their mentality in exactly the same manner as the rest of their fellow men. The divine messengers of old and the Manu had not done so. Their development belongs to higher worlds. Oh, said Roth. I bet you love this stuff, don't you? Moving on. They brought their higher wisdom into earthly relations. What they gave unto mankind was, quote, a gift from on high, end quote. Before the middle of the Atlantean era, men were not advanced far enough to grasp with their own faculties the import of the divine decrees. Now, in the period indicated, they were to reach this stage. Their earthly thought was to rise to the conception of the divine. Human initiates united themselves with those, good grief. Human initiates united themselves with those who were superhuman. This signifies an important change in the development of humanity. The first Atlanteans had not yet the choice of viewing their leaders as divine messengers, or not to do so. So they didn't have any free will. Gotcha. Moving on. For what these accomplished appeared, perforce, as a deed of the higher worlds. The divine origin was stamped on it. The account of their powers, the divine messengers of the Atlantean era, therefore sanctified beings, surrounded by the luster conferred on them by this power. Luster? Shine? Okay, moving on. The human initiates of this subsequent era, if considered externally, are men among men. To be sure, they remained in touch with the higher worlds, receptive to the revelations and appearances of the messengers of the gods. Well, that's got New Apostolic Reformation written all over it. Moving on. Only on exceptional occasions, in the case of the higher necessity, they made use of certain powers conferred on them from that source. Then did they perform feats which men failed to interpret in terms of the known laws and therefore rightly viewed as miracles. Nevertheless, it is the higher purpose of all of this to place men on their own feet, to develop perfectly their mentality. The human initiates are now the mediators between people and the higher powers, and initiation alone qualifies one for intercourse with the messengers of the gods. Wow. Catherine Crick, anyone? Moving on. The human initiates, the holy teachers, became then, in the beginning of the fifth root race, the leaders of the rest of mankind. The great priest kings of prehistoric times, attested to, if not historically, at least mythologically, belong to this class of initiates. The higher messengers of the gods gradually withdrew from this earth, handing over the leadership to these human initiates, but still assisting them by deed and word. Anunnaki, anyone? Anybody heard about that theory? Oh boy. Moving on. Were this not so, man would not attain to a free use of his mentality. Oh, so he couldn't go clear, as Scientology would say? Moving on. The world stands under divine guidance, but man should not be forced to acknowledge this fact, but should do so in consequence of their free exercise of his mental capacity. Only when he has attained to do this do the initiates gradually unveil to him their secrets. Well, that sounds like getting into the whole Q thing. You can't understand it unless you get into it. Good grief. Moving on. But this cannot be attained suddenly. Rather, is the whole development of the fifth root race a slow path to this goal. At first, the Manu himself still led his flock like children, but afterwards the leadership was gradually transferred to human initiates. And today the progress still continues to consist in a mingling of conscious and unconscious acting and thinking on the part of men. Again, I'm thinking of Robin Bullock and a whole bunch of those other false prophets, Thalfits, or anybody else that has any hidden knowledge that they want to sell you in a book or behind a paywall. Moving on. But this cannot be attained suddenly. Rather, in this whole development of the fifth root race, a slow path to this goal. I'm sorry, I read all that already. Picking back up here. Only at the end of the fifth root race, when after the progress made in intercourse of the sixth and seventh subraces, a sufficiently large number of men will be ready to receive knowledge, and the great initiate will be able to reveal himself to them publicly. The Maitreya's? Enlightenment? Downloads? Does any of this sound familiar? Moving on and finishing this chapter. The education of the fifth root race has therefore as its aim the production of a larger portion of mankind who shall attain so far as to follow freely a human Manu, just as was done by the nucleus of this fifth race with regard to the divine Manu. Well, talk about driving eugenics to the very end. Good grief. If you're not confused by now, if you're able to follow along with this untangling, more power to you. If you got any questions, please drop them in the comments below. I will see what I can do about getting them answered as quickly as I possibly can. Anyway, I hope you have found this interesting. Next video is going to be, of course, about Chapter 4. Makes sense if you got some logic in your head. And I hope that you enjoyed this. This is a bit of a challenge for me to untangle, and I'm having fun with it. I'm going to have to revisit this, but now that I've got this information in my mental data bank, stored away up there in Warehouse 13, I'll be coming back to it on references in further works in the future, I'm sure. If you enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up. Please feel free to share this information with anybody that you think might find benefit in it. Also, if you liked this information, please give me a sub, because I got a lot more videos coming up. So, until the next video hits, please remember, genuine mental health matters. And hydrate, hippie. It's summertime right now. And even if it wasn't, water's important. Everybody wants